So in this video, I'm going to talk about the philosophy and ethics of existentialism. So existentialism was a philosophical movement that began in the 19th century with the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and became very popular quickly and can be seen in the writings of Soren Kierkegaard, Martin Buber, Franz Kafka, and Jean-Paul Sartre, who's going to be the focus of this video. So I want to summarize real quickly just some of the themes of existentialism, and then I'll get right into Sartre. So one of the themes is the primacy of the particular situation in which a subject finds themselves. So a lot of previous pre-existentialist philosophers tended to focus on universals and tended to be kind of abstract. So for example, in the philosophy of Kant, you see a focus on the categorical imperative and the necessity to base oneself on a set of universal principles that can be universalized across time and on which one bases one's life. And although Kant does analyze particular situations, for him the real questions of ethics concerns what must I do in every situation. So Kant isn't particularly concerned with the particular world or context or social formation in which people find themselves. But that is a major focus on existentialism. And one of the reasons for this is that existentialism tends to reject the idea altogether of universal principles. Most of the existentialists, including the religious ones, were united in the belief that what one must do is not something one can know a priori prior to one's discovery in a particular situation, one's existence within a particular social formation or a particular crisis. There's a lot of emphasis on crisis in the existentialist philosophies. And one of the reasons for this, of course, is that the 20th century was a period of endless crises, political crises, economic crises. And so this tends to be internalized in the existentialist philosophers. Now, this is also one reason why existentialism tended to be more popular in the field of literature. Many writers, such as Kafka, for example, saw existentialism as a helpful philosophical worldview for writing short stories that would center around a particular crisis that an individual character faces and the ways that they try to achieve some small kind of goal. And this is indeed one of the things you tend to see in existentialism, is you tend to see a focus on individuals or groups of individuals that are very, very committed to a set of principles that are generated by the particularity of the situation in which they find themselves. So that's one of the ideas. Then it's a focus on particularity, whereas a lot of pre-existentialist philosophy is focused on universality. Existentialism focuses on particularity. A second major feature of existentialism is a focus on individual responsibility for one's future. Most of the existentialists were very interested in ideas such as faith, and they tried to construct in many ways a kind of a non-religious form of faith. And some of them were quite inspired by old religious texts such as the Torah. One of the writers, such as Kierkegaard, was very interested in the story of the binding of Isaac, and the fact that when Abraham goes to the top of the hill to bind his son, which Isaac, which God told him to do, he has no knowledge of the future of what's to happen. He's acting purely on the basis of faith. There's no rational explanation for his action, but he has this deep faith in God, that things are going to be okay. And this was actually something the existentialists found very interesting, because they saw this as a kind of guideline by which one could live one's life, even if one wasn't religious. And indeed, in the 20th century, there were many figures, such as Abraham, that had this extremely high level of faith in their principles. So if we look at political figures, many of the leaders of the European labor movement, many of the socialist movements, had tremendous belief that what they were fighting for would materialize in the near future, even if all odds were against them. Even in the face of severe political repression, many political leaders, such as Leon Trotsky, for example, continued to fight for their beliefs. And indeed, many of them were interested in existentialism for this reason. And so existentialism puts an emphasis on faith. It believes that reason can't explain everything. Not everything has to be rational. Existentialism is in no way anti-science. Science, however, is not something that is relevant to specifically existentialism because it focuses on the questions of individual responsibility and faith insofar as it relates to one's particular existential project. Okay, I'll get more into what that believes. So what I mean, so the second point, individual responsibility for one's future. The idea is that the existentialists had, they didn't like the idea of trying to blame other people or blame society for your problems. You still had a responsibility to respond to it in a particular way. Many of the existentialists, like Sartre, were also Marxists. So they tended to see social problems in relation to the class structure of society and tended to view problems through class conflicts between capitalists and workers. But the existentialists still nonetheless believed that an individual socialist, for example, or trade unionist or worker is still responsible for their own particular involvement within a particular political movement or whatnot. So the existentialists were really opposed to blaming society solely for every little problem, and instead called upon you to respond to that. So there's always this emphasis on the call and the response that you give to it. So that's the second theme. The third theme of existentialism is a great emphasis on lived experience. Now, one of the reasons for this is that one of the major existentialist philosophers was Edmund Husserl. He was the founder of a current within philosophy called Phenomenology in the 1920s in Germany. And what phenomenology wanted to do was to get back to lived experience. It kind of thought that the lived experience of living in one's body, of living in one's consciousness, had been somewhat lost by Kantianism, which tended to be very abstract. And Husserl wanted to get back to this. He wanted to try to recover this lost experiential kind of substratum that he believed was present in every particular subject. What he developed what was called the Phenomenological Reduction, and the idea behind this was to take a kind of critical distance towards the world, to say the world doesn't exist in the philosophical sense. It exists, it's there, but to try to take a distance towards the meaning that we've given to it. The phenomenological reduction reduces the world to a kind of set of phenomena and tries to understand how we as subjects participated in the construction of meaning within that kind of this phenomenological experience. And this was very important to Sartre, who we're going to see. Sartre was an avid student of Husserl, who studied his works, and Husserl's writings play a prominent role in Sartre's philosophy. Okay, so the fourth major element of existentialism is the idea of it has a lot of focus on principles. And this goes back to the idea of individual responsibility. What we tend to see in existentialist writings are, either in literature, characters who have a set of very strong principles, but principles that they themselves kind of constructed, that they weren't given to them by their upbringing or their family or their religious background, but that they came to believe. And so there's a lot of emphasis on kind of being real and being true to oneself. There's also a lot of emphasis on bad faith, on ways that we tend to deceive ourselves, on ways that we tend to maybe hide the fact that we're free. And this is the fifth major element is freedom is a huge element of existentialism. Not freedom in the kind of libertarian sense. Freedom, as we'll see in existentialism, simply says that we are responsible for the world that we help to bring into being. There's a great element of responsibility. Freedom for existentialism doesn't necessarily mean you can do whatever you want. Many of them were very committed to the idea still of having a kind of law-ordered society of some sort. But they emphasize the element of responsibility, that you have to react to the world around you. If you don't react, you've already betrayed yourself. Right. So I want to now talk a little bit about the major philosopher of existentialism, Jean-Paul Sartre. I will give you a little bit of background about him. So Sartre was very much a product of the 20th century. His family members fought in the First World War. He was a child during that period. He lived much of his life in Paris. Studied in prominent universities, and was a philosophy professor. And in the 1930s, Sartre spent most of his time writing a major book called Nausea. And the nausea refers particularly to the nauseating feeling that we get in the face of freedom, in the face of realizing that we are free, that there's no being around us that can force us to act, whether human or divine, but that we still have to respond to the world, that we have to take action. And this is nauseating. This causes a kind of anxiety. Another major theme of existentialism is anxiety. And this novel was Sartre's first major literary masterpiece, for which he won the major literary award. Of course, Sartre, trying to be somewhat edgy in the time, rejected the award because he didn't want to support the kind of bourgeois literary establishment, and so he rejected the prize money. And later in his life, he wanted to get it back. Now, Sartre lived at a very difficult time in the 40s, the early 40s. The Nazi imperialists occupied France, and what you saw was a part of it gave birth to what was called the Vichy regime, which was a Nazi collaborationist regime that directly collaborated with the Germans, with the fascists. Sartre became politicized by this. He was captured by the Nazis. He fought in the army, but because he had a kind of lazy eye or something like this, he convinced one of the Nazi officers in the prison that he was ill, and somehow he was able to. They let him go. It's quite amazing. And Sartre quickly joined the resistance to fascism. I mean, if you were living in France or the Netherlands or Belgium, all these countries that were occupied by or Poland, in the Soviet Union in the 40s, you would have been called upon. What do you do in this situation? And Sartre saw this as became a major influence on his existentialist thinking. The war and how you're supposed to respond to it played a huge role in Sartre's thinking. What do? Do you resist? Do you fight the fascists, or do you collaborate, or do you do nothing? You know, these were major questions for Sartre. They were very concrete. They weren't abstract. They were life and death questions. And at that time, Sartre helped to set up a journal. I forgot the name of it, but he set up a major literary journal that continues to exist to this day and became a major organ of the anti-fascist resistance. After the war, Sartre published his first philosophical masterpiece, Being and Nothingness, where he fully lays out and systematizes his existentialist philosophy. In 1949, he joined the Communist Party of France. He was only a member for 4 years. And every intellectual in this time in France was a member of the Communist Party. You couldn't be political in France in the 50s and not be in the Communist Party if you were an intellectual. But he wasn't. He was the party leaders didn't really trust him because although Sartre agreed with Marxism, he had a very kind of bit of a strange approach to it that was somewhat different from the kind of establishment Marxism of the Communist Party of France, became very popular, by the way, after the war. After the war, the Communist Party of France led major strikes in the factories of Renault in France. It played a major role in French society. It was a huge political force. Okay, and then to quickly sum up, Sartre became very involved in the political conflicts of his time. One of the reasons he broke with the Communist Party was the question of Algerian independence. So Algeria was a longtime French colony, and in the 50s, I think it was 1954, I believe, the Algerian people launched a major war of national liberation against the French imperialists. It was an all-out war led by the National Liberation Front, and the Algerian people fought for many, many years against the French who were occupying their country with brute force of arms. It was an extremely racist society. The Algerians, mostly Arab Algerians as well as Berbers, lived in slums while the French amassed huge wealth as a result of this colonial occupation. In this war, the Communist Party of France actually called upon the Algerian people to unite with the working people of France and form a single united French republic that would be socialist, but it would still Algeria would be autonomous, but would still be part of France's colonial holding. This was for Sartre. This was unacceptable. And so Sartre became close friends with the intellectual guy by the name of Frantz Fanon, who was a very important intellectual in France in the 60s. He was an Algerian intellectual who wrote a book called Wretched of the Earth, which was one of the first published. It was a major condemnation of not just French colonialism, but colonialism in general, which he called pure violence, the pure force of violence. And it was interesting in Fanon's philosophy, you see a lot of influence from Sartre, of his kind of existentialist philosophy and how this could be applied to the anti-colonial situation. Okay, so Sartre, in 1968, there were major student uprisings in Paris, major workers' strikes as well. It led for about a month, between May and June of 1968. The whole of Paris and the whole of France, for that matter, was in revolt, and people thought this was a revolutionary situation. And Sartre was very politically engaged with this period and emerged as a kind of prominent intellectual. He was already prominent, but major supporter of this. Towards the end of his life, he supported Maoism, the philosophy of Mao Zedong that was popular from China and it was very popular in France. And Sartre joined a little Maoist organization, and you could see pictures of him handing out the newspaper, for which he was arrested a few times. And in the 70s, Sartre, towards the end of his life, he became blind. He had a close relationship with the feminist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, one of the prominent. She wrote a book called The Second Sex, which is one of the most popular feminist classics of the 20th century. And they had a kind of close romantic relationship. And so towards the end of his life, Sartre became blind. And apparently Simone de Beauvoir would read him his books, because this was his favorite activity to do. But they continued to the very end of their life to work together and to write together. Okay, so now to get to Sartre's philosophy. I have my notes here. This is where I keep looking aside. So the main principle in Sartre's philosophy is the slogan "Existence precedes essence," which he develops this idea in a short pamphlet, which I think was a lecture called "Existentialism is Humanism," where basically he develops a kind of philosophical justification for the idea that we are totally free, and that number one, the first principle that Sartre has is there's no God. He doesn't believe in God. But he doesn't make a big deal out of it ever. He's not any kind of Richard Dawkins figure. Sartre is not someone who spent a lot of time defending this. Rather, what he wanted to do was to deduce all the principles and moral principles of a consistent atheistic position. If you don't believe in God, then the following holds. But as I said, there were many religious writers, such as Soren Kierkegaard and Martin Buber, who were religious and did believe in God, and still nonetheless found great inspiration in existentialism. So if you don't believe in God, what does this mean for ethics? Well, Sartre believes he has the answer. And the first idea is that, number one, you as a human being don't have an essence. And what is it? In philosophy, traditionally, the idea was that you have an essence. You have this essential set of properties that defines you. There are particular duties, things that you must do, a whole set of moral principles, things you have to do, things you can't do, things you should do. Sartre rejects all this. He says there's nothing like that because there's no God that could actually create that. Instead, what he thinks is that by existing in the world, by being involved in a particular situation, you create your own essence. And for Sartre, essence is nothing other than what has been. So a person has an essence, a group of people has an essence, a collective has an essence. But his focus here is particularly on the individual. So I'm born, I'm thrown into the world. When I'm thrown into the world, I'm nothing. And Sartre says you'll always be nothing, essentially. Not nothing in the sense that you won't achieve anything, but nothingness is what defines you as a human being. Because there's no essence, there's no predetermined essence that could give me any kind of meaning. There's no meaning to life. You know, people often ask, what is the meaning of life? Sartre would say there is no meaning to life. Essence is simply what has been. It is your past. It's everything you've done. It's everything that has become. And it can't be changed. Once you've done it, it can't be changed. Of course, you can change your relationship to it, but ultimately, essence is what has been. And so, because there's what defines us is nothingness. It's going to get to this in a little more detail in a moment. Sartre is going to say there's nothing that can determine me to act in any way. I'm going to be burdened with this terrible kind of sense of free choice, right? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about how he gets to this kind of conclusion. So in his work, Being and Nothingness, Sartre makes an important philosophical distinction between being in itself and being for itself. Okay, these words sound kind of pretentious, and I personally am not a huge fan of this, but it is a kind of helpful distinction. So being in itself is a very simple concept, actually. Is everything that exists outside of subjects, outside of human life. So number one, everything that's physical, the trees, the rivers, the physical world, all of that is part of being in itself, right? It simply is. Now, plants might have some consciousness, animals might have some consciousness, but it simply is. It is. The physical things are. That's all they don't have the characteristic of being self-conscious. But also, being in itself is also the past. It's everything that's in history, everything that's happened in the past. It's all the facts. Being in itself is also facts. When scientists discover things, the laws of gravity, for example, the laws of nature, this is all part of being in itself. Now, another thing that we could include in this is what Sartre would call, and what Marxism particularly would call, the objective material conditions of production. right? So the class conditions in society are part of being in itself, right? The social divisions that exist. Also, things like the existence of racism. We've seen the last few years a major movement against police brutality in America that has addressed racism, that has addressed the issue of prisons and police violence against people of color, and the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. All of this has addressed being in itself, the objective conditions. These are all the things that exist outside of us, right? And in some ways, some of these things can just be changed. We can't really change nature, but we can still intervene in it. We can't change the past, but we can change our relationship to it. We can change the objective conditions to an extent. They exist. Marx famously said, human beings make history in an environment not of their own making. This is a kind of existentialist formulation, because the idea is there may exist a class-divided society in which there's divisions between workers and capitalists, for example, between working people and big business. But working people, can still intervene by organizing themselves to transform these objective conditions. It's not static. It doesn't have to stay the way it is, right? So even though being in itself exists, our relationship to it can change. So that's being in itself. Being in itself is everything that's kind of the current status quo, to some extent. That's how Sartre defines it. On the other hand, he distinguishes between being for itself. Being for itself, for Sartre, number one is, at an individual level, is consciousness. And he gets this from a phenomenological definition I mentioned earlier, Edmund Husserl. Consciousness for Sartre is always consciousness of something else. So I'm conscious. This means my consciousness is directed towards the outside. I'm conscious of the physical world. I'm conscious of my being in the world. I'm conscious of my past. I'm conscious of what I've done. I'm conscious of what I've become. I'm conscious of what I could be. I'm conscious of all these things. This is for Sartre what consciousness is. And in Sartre's philosophy, consciousness is always involved in an existential situation. And the existential situation is the particular kind of circumstances I find myself in a particular social formation, in a particular relation with a certain group of people or with a certain person. All of that is something I'm conscious of, right? Consciousness for Sartre is always directed towards the future. Consciousness is what has not yet become. The future is the object of consciousness, essentially. It's also the past is the object of consciousness. But as I said, I can change my relationship to the past, but that's something that takes place in the future. The present, for Sartre, is the kind of process of becoming, the process of becoming something. And all of this is part of the being for itself. And for Sartre, consciousness has the power of negation, right? And in philosophy, negation means the power to bring something out of being, the power to make something not exist, right? So if I am aware, for example, of oppression in society, or class division, or racism, I can be aware of all these things. But the question is, what do I do? How do I intervene? I'm called upon by the situation to react to this. There's nothing that can predetermine this for me. Well, one response is I can do nothing. I can just kind of sit back and watch. Another is, I can write an article. I can use my abilities to write an article that helps people theoretically make sense of the situation. Another thing I can do is to join an activist group and try to participate in the struggles of the oppressed. Another possibility is I can join a trade union, or I can help to organize one if it doesn't exist. All of these things are things I can do. They're my possibilities, but they're not things that have to happen, right? Because they haven't happened yet. And they don't exist, essentially. I mean, the organizations might exist, the experience of doing these things might exist, but I'm still called upon by the situation to do these things, right? So that's what the for itself is. It's defined by nothingness. And I'm nothing in that sense. That's when Sartre says you're nothing, it means that there's nothing that can determine you to act except the decision that you make, right? And so this means that there is a radical contradiction between being in itself, everything that exists in the world, and for it, the being for itself, the consciousness that subjects have, right? A group of people can also kind of become a kind of consciousness, right? So a class of people, the working class, can exist more or less in a kind of non-conscious way. So the Hungarian Marxist Georg Lukács had this notion of class consciousness. And what he argues along very similar existentialist lines is in most situations, working people exist in the same way Sartre calls being in itself. They simply exist as workers. They wake up, they go to work, they do their job, they go home. They live their lives. They live a normal life. But they don't really have the consciousness of themselves as a class and what they can do as a class, right? It's only when they become aware that when they organize themselves as workers, they might have the power to radically transform society in their own interest and to improve their lives, right? Now, Lukács was very much a Leninist, and he believed that you needed an external political organization to come in and educate the workers so that they could become conscious of their own needs and objectives, and that these revolutionaries, to use the term, would organize them for large-scale social transformations, right? And that he has this notion of class consciousness. The workers only become conscious when they become engaged, involved in a particular social sequence, political sequence, that leads to some major kind of social transformation. So this would be how, like, on a collective level, it would happen. You can also see it, last year we saw major upheavals in the Black Lives Matter movement, in the people's movements across the United States that were confronting police brutality, that were confronting institutional racism. This was a moment when the African American people and their allies became conscious of their needs as a people and started to act collectively as one. And again, there were all sorts of meetings. There were art installations. There were films that were made by this. There were rappers and R&B artists and pop singers and all the rest of it who were responding to this. There were football players, who showed their solidarity. There was an all-scale social transformation, and this was a result of the emergence of consciousness, right? And now to come to some conclusions that Sartre draws from this. So number one, we're free, and for Sartre, most of us go through our lives more or less living as, what he calls bad faith. To live in bad faith is to believe that we're not free, is to reject that we're free. Now, in his Being and Nothingness, he gives this example of a waiter. And basically, this waiter is really, really attached to his role as a waiter. He doesn't really see much life outside of being a waiter. He just kind of goes through the motions. He does all the gestures, and he's very, very attached to his role. And he doesn't think there's anything else he can do but being a waiter. He is a waiter. Whereas Sartre says he's not a waiter. Being a waiter is just one of his possibilities. Now, he may have decided to be a waiter because that was one of the opportunities available to him. But the potential of something other, the potential of a different occupation or other things, is something that in Sartre's mind is always there. But he thinks this waiter is living in bad faith because he rejects this from himself. And Sartre thinks we have a tendency to live in bad faith anytime we start to say, well, such and such happened for a reason. It had to happen this way. Sartre was a Marxist, but there is a certain tendency of Marxism to reduce everything to economic explanations that you believe. So Marxism, just to explain, often tends to believe that, for example, if you have a certain belief, it's just because the ideology of the ruling class put that belief in your mind, and that's why you believe it. There's no other reason. And everything is kind of explained through simply economic explanations, class explanations, and all of other complexities, political issues that are often important to address, specific cultural specificities. These things are sometimes neglected. And Sartre thinks there is a tendency, even in Marxism, sometimes to reject the fact that one's still free to decide how one responds to a particular political situation. So we're radically free. This means that nothing can determine us to act, because essentially we're nothing. If we were something, then there would be an essence that defines us, that can move us to act. Sartre also, he's very extreme. He rejects, for example, instincts. Sartre doesn't believe in explanations by instincts or, this idea that if someone commits an act of violence or murder out of passion, Sartre rejects this. He has a little essay called The Emotions, where he goes so far as to say that we decide our emotional response. Now, obviously, so if you get really angry, Sartre thinks this is something you decided to do. You were free to decide it, because ultimately, although you may have felt the anger rising in you, you have the ability to be conscious of that. And because you can be conscious, you can still decide not to do it, right? So although he would acknowledge your emotions may happen, more or less biologically, and your biology is part of the in itself, right? The things that happen inside in your brain. Sartre still thinks you can decide not to do it, right? So some of his theories might have been, misproven or proven by modern psychology, but I mean, it's nonetheless a very liberating philosophy for some people, at least, to think this. And this brings us to the question of moral dilemmas in Sartre's philosophy. So, there's this, famous trolley problem in ethics. It's the idea that you're in a moving train, and on one side of the tracks there's 5 people, and on the other side of the track there's a one baby or one person. You have to move the lever. If you move it to one side, 5 people dies. If you move it to the other, the one baby dies. What do? Right? Well, Sartre would say, well, there's nothing that can tell you how to act. Sartre would probably try to find some interesting explanation where he might say, well, try to make it so you can still make the train maybe derail or something so that no one gets hurt and no one on the train gets hurt. Or try to, make it so that one of the carriages in the train derail and the rest of them move. I don't know, something like this. But Sartre would say there's nothing about the particular... there's no divine being that's going to tell you how to act. There's no moral principles. That's the kind of situation you'll have to respond. But to be honest, I don't think for this would ever be a problem for Sartre, because Sartre is only concerned with particular ethical and social and political situations in which someone might find themselves in, and in which they will have to respond. But Sartre would say, even in the most brutal situations, where someone's holding a gun to your head and saying, do this or I'll, kill this person that's close to you, this kind of dilemma, Sartre would still say you're free to choose at that moment. He kind of controversially said that he felt the most free when he was forced to constantly make decisions when France was occupied by the fascists, and people were most aware of their freedom at that moment. It's not that they were free. Obviously, they were enslaved by the fascist occupation, but their internal freedom was most present, and what they did was something that they decided, and that is ultimately the philosophy of Sartre. And so this comes to the conclusion. Sartre says we're condemned to be free. Sartre says this isn't a pleasant, happy ending. The fact that we're free is something that causes anxiety. In his philosophy, anxiety isn't necessarily a psychological state. It's the experience of non-being, of nothingness, that there's nothing that can determine you to act. Anxiety is the consciousness of that very nothingness, which he distinguishes from fear. Fear always has a particular object for Sartre. When you're afraid of a spider or heights or whatever. But with anxiety, you're afraid of the nothingness itself, of non-being, of the future, but not the future in terms of what you think will happen, but simply the kind of uncanny experience of totally being unaware, of not knowing, and knowing that you ultimately have some role to play in it, that your contributions to the world are important. So some people tend to think Sartre's philosophy is pessimistic, but I don't necessarily think this is true. I think what's one of the optimistic conclusions I would draw from Sartre is that every person can contribute something to the world, but they have to decide how to do this. Decisions. Number two, decisions are very important in Sartre's philosophy. Sartre is not concerned with meaningless little consumer choices. What commodity do I purchase? What clothing do I buy? Where do I go on holiday? These are not important choices. For Sartre, the only important choices are the major decisions that one makes in one's life that could change the whole trajectory of what happens in the future. And so the optimistic conclusion is that people have the opportunity to change that. And number three, the optimistic conclusion, I would say, is that things can always change. Even in the most brutal, oppressive situations, whether it's horrendous racist violence or oppressive impoverishment or situations of extreme deprivation or war, people are still capable of changing the world. I would say most of the time these things don't happen because of individual decisions, but every person can contribute to that in some way, and things can change. But ultimately, one of the conclusions is that change isn't guaranteed. There has to nonetheless be a conscious decision by a group of people, or in some situations, a particular individual, to make some major change in the world. So at an individual level, the major changes result because we make a decision that we're going to change our lives. So, someone could be living maybe in a not so great way, or treating people wrongly, or doing bad things, but they make a decision to ultimately change their lives. They make some major decision. And Sartre would say that's always a possibility because existence precedes essence. What you've been is something that has come into being through your existence, and you ultimately bear the responsibility for that. But what will be is ultimately something that can change and for which you ultimately can still make an intervention. And at a kind of collective level, society can change when a group of people decide we're going to collectively intervene in history and change its course in order to make it better, in order to make a better world with less oppression, a more peaceful world, where people cooperate rather than competing brutally. This kind of Squid Game universe. Squid Game, the famous Netflix TV show, is a very, very much an existentialist TV show, by the way. Each of the characters is in this brutal, violent it's not a video game, this brutal game, and is having to respond to the situation. And each of them do this differently. Some in the very extreme selfishness. The main character, I forgot his name, nonetheless maintains his kind of principled care for the other his entire life till the very end. Um, okay, those are the major conclusions. That is existentialism. I'll leave the rest up to you to think about what you think about it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and hopefully there will be more in the future.